It was an ordinary weekend afternoon, and I was in my small study at home taking care of some restaurant chores. As the manager of a small Western restaurant in the city center, I have a busy schedule that often requires me to work overtime. Even on this weekend, I couldn't quite relax, but rather, I got caught up in some business. While I was reviewing a financial statement, the sound of my wife Cindy talking came from the living room. As I worked, I took my customary snack. I soon realized that Cindy seemed to be on the phone with her good friend Linda. The two of them chatted endlessly, talking about everything from the south to the north, with the occasional intimate female conversation thrown in for good measure. It wasn't until more than half an hour later that the sound of Linda hanging up finally came from her side. I took the opportunity to put down the work at hand and walked to the living room to say hello to Cindy. But the moment I stepped into the living room, I saw that my wife's face did not look right. Cindy's face was heavy, her eyebrows were locked, and she seemed to be in some kind of deep contemplation and conflict. I seldom saw this kind of melancholy look on her face, so I thought she had some kind of conflict or argument with Linda. "What's the matter, dear? Did something bad happen with Linda?" I asked as I walked over to Cindy with concern and opened my mouth tentatively. Cindy did not answer my question immediately, but stared ahead, as if she was making some kind of big decision. After a while, she spoke slowly, with a hint of hesitation in her tone. "Jim, I don't know what to say. Linda just told me something on the phone. About you? It made me nervous to hear it." "Linda? The one who's always gossiping? What did she say this time? How much has she twisted the truth? What the hell is going on? Tell me the truth." I tried to keep my tone calm, while inwardly preparing myself for any eventuality. Cindy took a deep breath and then slowly said what Linda had told her. "Linda said that last Saturday, she saw you and a waitress hugging at the restaurant we always go to. You seemed very close. It was like a couple thing?" "What?" I exclaimed, staring wide-eyed at Cindy with a mixture of anger and helplessness. I remembered last Saturday, of course. I'd been working late at the diner, and I'd run into Marilyn, a distant relative, on my way out, and we'd hugged and exchanged pleasantries as the only family we had left. But to anyone else, it would have been easy to misunderstand. But how could Linda judge me so arbitrarily on the basis of a single word? How could she have concluded that the woman I hugged was a waitress? I even wondered if she was trying to drive a wedge between Cindy and me by saying that. "Honey, you don't really believe Linda's nonsense, do you?" I looked at Cindy helplessly. "You know how hard I work at the restaurant. How could I do that kind of cheating?" I looked at Cindy helplessly. "You know how hard I work at the restaurant. How could I possibly do that kind of cheating thing? The woman Linda was talking about must be my distant relative Marilyn. Only you've never met her." Cindy seemed to look at me with some skepticism, a look of confusion and overwhelm on her face. But Linda said that she saw you two hugging each other and looking very close. It was like you were a couple." "Jesus, Cindy," I said, feeling helpless. "Do I have to re-explain to you how devoted and loyal I am to you? How could you believe Linda's nonsense so easily?" Cindy sighed, and the look on her face finally eased a bit. However, I noticed that in the depths of her eyes, there still seemed to be a trace of skepticism. "Well, I believe you." She deliberated for a long time before saying, "But then again, if something like this does happen, you have to tell me first, right? I don't want to be kept in the dark about this." "That's natural." I nodded and smiled with a slight reluctance. Cindy seemed to have put Linda's comment behind her and quickly got back to her other chores. But that night, I tossed and turned and had a hard time getting to sleep. What was the reason for Linda's uncalled-for comment? I couldn't help but wonder if she was trying to drive a wedge between Cindy and me. For the next few days, I wondered about Linda's comment from time to time. Although on the surface Cindy and I were getting along as we always had, I subconsciously wondered if Cindy had already had some doubts about me. A few weeks later, Cindy and I were invited to a birthday party that our friends Barbara and Tony were throwing for their daughter. As old friends, we were not going to miss such an important family gathering. The party was held in the back garden of Barbara's house. The weather was beautiful and the setting was very warm and inviting. A group of children were playing on the grass, while we adults were chatting in small groups and occasionally clapping and cheering for the children's games. It was an ordinary family gathering. But in the midst of this cozy atmosphere, a man appeared who was about to take my life to a whole new level. I was vaguely aware that my wife Cindy's attention was drawn to a handsome man, Bob, when he pushed through the door. Bob was tall and handsome, in his early 30s, dressed in a well-tailored gray suit, with an elegant and generous appearance. As soon as he walked in the door, he met the envious eyes of countless ladies, and Cindy was unavoidable. I saw her casting a few fiery glances, and I was afraid that she would be staring at this handsome man with impunity if she continued to stare. I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy in my heart. "Hello there, guys. Sorry I'm late," Bob greeted without fuss and was soon greeted warmly by Barbara, the owner. I realized that Bob was an old friend of Barbara's and a close friend of hers. With Bob joining the party, the atmosphere became even more lively and boisterous. People were bustling around him, discussing, joking, and hitting on this handsome, sunny man. I, on the other hand, suddenly realized that Cindy was glancing in Bob's direction from time to time. Although I didn't want to admit it, I did feel a tinge of jealousy and insecurity in my heart. At that moment, Cindy took the initiative to come over to Bob's side, pretending to fetch him some food and drinks. The two of them chatted with each other, occasionally interspersed with some intimate physical contact and small pats on the shoulder. As I watched my wife practically clinging to the handsome man, I couldn't help but subconsciously start to make some small gestures to try to get Cindy's attention. But no matter how much I waved my arms and cleared my throat, Cindy was oblivious, and all her attention seemed to be focused on her conversation with Bob. At that moment, a heart-wrenching scene appeared. Cindy even patted Bob's chest affectionately. Although it was just a small gesture, it was enough to wake me up. Was Cindy sending me a signal? Is she trying to stimulate my jealousy? And for what? My heart felt like it was on fire, and it was hot. Anger and jealousy burned in my chest, so much so that I couldn't even taste the food and wine that was right in front of me. I even wanted to go there to stop their intimacy, but my reasoning overpowered my impulses. I began to reflect on the cause of it all. Could it be? Is it because I've been working so much overtime lately that I've been neglecting Cindy? Or is it because she's already dissatisfied with our married life? She's been suppressing it and finally released it today with Bob's appearance? All sorts of assumptions were running through my head, and I could hardly figure out where the situation had come from. It wasn't until Bob and Cindy's scene was finally over that I breathed a sigh of relief and made up my mind to find a chance to talk to Cindy. The party ended late in the evening, with the kids leaving one by one, leaving us adults to slowly clean up the mess in the garden. I noticed that Cindy seemed to be keeping Bob at arm's length for fear of making me feel uncomfortable. On his way out, Bob gave Barbara and Cindy a warm hug and promised to continue the party next time. I felt a strong sense of insecurity again as I watched them bond. When I got home, I was uncharacteristically quiet, and Cindy seemed to realize what was going on as she shied away from looking me in the eye. "Honey, we need to talk." I finally got up the courage to speak. Cindy seemed to realize the gravity of the situation as well, and she nodded, looking slightly flustered. "Please tell me honestly what happened at the party today. Between you and Bob. What's going on?" I asked in a firm tone. Cindy seemed a little flustered and embarrassed as she avoided my gaze and paced the living room. "Tell me, is it my fault that I've been so busy with work lately that I've neglected to take care of your life? Or are you already tired of our marriage?" I continued to ask. My tone was full of helplessness. Cindy finally stopped, and she turned around, a look of determination on her face. "Jim, I have to be honest with you." She took a deep breath before speaking. "The truth is, I did approach Bob at the party today and acted a little close. But it was all for a reason." My heart suddenly sank. It seems that my guess is correct. Cindy's behavior today is out of some kind of premeditation and purpose. But for what reason did she do such a great harm to our relationship? What's the reason? You give me a reasonable explanation. I furrowed my eyebrows and raised my tone a few notches. "Do you remember the last time Linda told me she saw you cuddling with a waitress in a restaurant?" Cindy asked me in return. My face sank. How could I have expected her to use that as a reason? "Don't tell me you're doing this because you bought into Linda's nonsense." Hurtful? Jim, don't you think you're being a little heavy-handed with your words? Cindy stood up from the couch as well, and clasped her hands to her chest. I certainly don't take Linda's words lightly, but you've been acting a little erratic lately. Should I be suspicious that you really have something else going on out there?
I'm perverse.
That's just from working too much. I retorted loudly. But have you really done nothing wrong at all? Not a single thing to warrant my suspicion. Cindy's tone raised a few notches as well. And why did you irritate me in that way? Do you think I'm going to get jealous over you flashing another man at a party? Are you treating our relationship as a couple like child's play? I questioned angrily. Of course I don't mean that. Cindy was also pressed by me and almost blushed. I just wanted to test your reaction to see if you still love me. If you really loved me, you wouldn't have to do that. Can't we communicate with each other anymore? I snorted. Then why don't you explain it to me? Did Linda look away or not? Cindy was aggressive, looking like she wanted to make a statement. The two of us got into a huge fight, airing out all of our grievances and frustrations. In the end, Cindy huffed, grabbed her coat, and left the house without looking back. I, on the other hand, was so furious that I slammed a vase in the living room to the ground. This argument brought my disappointment and skepticism towards Cindy to a new level. I began to wonder if she was still faithful to our marriage. Otherwise, why would she do that kind of intimate service to another man? While I was wrapped up in anger and feelings of betrayal, there was a knock at the door. I subconsciously thought it was Cindy, but when I opened it, it was my best friend Tony. Hey man, what's up with you guys? I heard you guys making a lot of noise, so I came over to check it out. Tony looked at me with concern. I sighed and invited him in, and as soon as Tony walked into the living room, he saw the vase that I had broken. Something that serious happened? He said in surprise. I nodded, pulled a beer out of the fridge, and winked at Tony. He took it, and we sat side by side on the couch, drinking and talking about the day. So, you're saying that Cindy blatantly seduced that Bob guy at the party just to test your reaction to her? Tony summarized with a frown. I nodded and told him exactly what happened. It does sound a little excessive, but not entirely unreasonable. Tony said thoughtfully, but then again, that Linda's a bit too slick, isn't she? I'd say she's the one to blame for all this. Yes, it was because of her words that Cindy did what she did. I gritted my teeth and said, but that being said, how can I explain the scene I witnessed today? There were indeed some very ambiguous behavior between Cindy and that Bob. Tony was deep in thought. After a long time, he said his own judgment. From the situation you told me, I think you two are actually at fault. Cindy's approach is obviously a bit too radical. She should not be suspicious into that kind of behavior. But you have never taken the initiative to explain to her what Linda said, which led to her suspicion increased. So there was a miscommunication between the two of you. Listening to Tony's analysis, my mind was suddenly enlightened. I couldn't help but be shocked by my own stupidity. Indeed, if I had taken the initiative to explain Linda's news to Cindy, things might not have gotten to this point at all. Instead, I kept silent and kept Cindy in suspense. So, I think the best thing you guys can do right now is to communicate and get all the doubts out of each other's minds. Tony patted me on the shoulder. Good luck, man. But don't come home too late for my brother-in-law to join in on the misunderstanding. After that, Tony left. I was deep in thought and began to reflect on my argument with Cindy. My anger had been stupid and impulsive, making it impossible for us to communicate with each other and making the misunderstanding bigger and bigger. In order to save the marriage, I had to take immediate action. Otherwise, our relationship would only fall into a deeper rift. I decided to go to the restaurant the next morning to get to the bottom of the misunderstanding, and Cindy needed to know the truth, and I needed to explain and apologize to her. Early the next morning, I rushed to the restaurant. As the manager here, I can naturally come and go at any time. It was in the staff lounge in the back of the restaurant that I found my cousin Marilyn, the culprit in the wrongful death case. Jim, it's so good you're finally here. When she saw it was me, Marilyn came forward and gave me a big hug. Yeah, I need your help. I nodded, feeling a little nervous. In fact, Marilyn and I hugged that day because she had traveled all the way from Cyprus and wanted to revisit her hometown. As each other's only remaining relatives, she and I would naturally meet and hug. But I didn't expect Linda to see us at that very moment, and she mistook us for a couple. My wife and I almost had a serious conflict because of the misunderstanding that day. I explained sincerely to Marilyn, "That's why I've come here today, to ask you to testify and help me set the record straight." Marilyn listened and nodded with an apologetic look on her face. "Don't mind, Jim. If I hadn't made this surprise visit, how could you have suffered this misunderstanding? I'm the one who should take full responsibility for this." I shook my head and said I didn't blame her for anything. It took me a while to find Christy, the waitress who had witnessed the scene. With Marilyn's help, and the three of us got together to go over the whole thing again. Soon enough, I had enough evidence to get to the bottom of it. It was in Christy's testimony that I found the opportunity and courage to communicate with Cindy again. That afternoon, I went to Cindy's friend's house, where she was staying. When I saw her, I told her the whole story of the past few days. I told her how Linda had added fuel to the fire, how it had led to the conflict between us, and how I had investigated the situation. "So you see, dear, you're completely blinded by that, Linda," I said sincerely. "There's nothing out of the ordinary between Marilyn and I. It's all just a misunderstanding." Cindy was so ashamed that she almost cried out in pain. "Oh my God, how could I? How could I have fallen for Linda's words so easily? How come I didn't trust you first, but did something as hurtful as that? Jim, I'm so sorry for you." I rushed forward and hugged Cindy, letting her spill her tears all over my shoulder. "Okay, let bygones be bygones. What's important now is that we re-emphasize our communication and trust." Cindy nodded and seemed to find some courage and hope in my arms. From then on, she would never be easily swayed by outside gossip. "But do you still feel disappointed and angry about my behavior toward Bob at the party the other day?" she asked me, choking back a sob. I pondered for a moment and still spoke my mind bluntly. "Of course, that does make me feel very hurt and disappointed, because what you did almost overturned the foundation of our relationship." Cindy lowered her head, like a child who had done something wrong. However, I also realized that it was just an accidental impulse and mistake. I quickly reassured, "I can forgive you as long as you make up your mind that you will never make such a mistake again." Cindy nodded vigorously, her eyes firm and praying for forgiveness. "I swear, I will cherish our relationship and never let you suffer such pain again." It was a great relief to see my wife so sincere. This misunderstanding has finally been resolved in a satisfactory manner, and we will both learn a valuable lesson from this experience. We embraced each other, our foreheads pressed together. We agreed to improve communication, emphasize each other's feelings, and not let trivial matters affect the foundation of our relationship. This time, we were able to go back to the light from the bottom of the valley. After this episode, Cindy and I seem to be closer than ever. We both learned a lesson about the importance of communication and trust. As a first step, Cindy took the initiative to call Linda to express her anger and disappointment. She blamed Linda for fabricating the rumor so falsely that it almost destroyed a happy family. "How could you do such a thing, Linda? Have you ever considered how much damage your words could cause?" Cindy said angrily. Linda apologized over the phone, seemingly realizing that she had been too impulsive in her reckless behavior. "I'm sorry, Cindy. I was just joking around. I didn't realize it would cause such a consequence. I'll pay attention to it, and I won't talk nonsense anymore." Cindy hung up the phone full of indignation and turned to look at me with apologies in her eyes. "Jim, I am really too negligent, even by Linda so simple a few words on the blindfold. I almost ruined our relationship for so many years." I went up to hold my wife, patted her back to comfort her. "Don't blame yourself like this. Let bygones be bygones. Now the most important thing is, we have to cherish each other's feelings again. Let it regain trust and enthusiasm on a new basis." Cindy nodded, a glimmer returning to her eyes. As a next step, we decided to sincerely apologize to those of you who may have been affected and disappointed. We begin at Barbara and Tony's home, where Barbara, as one of the parties involved, witnessed the entire party and is naturally upset about Cindy's behavior. "Barbara, we can't thank you enough. If it wasn't for your open mind, we would have really screwed things up this time." I said sincerely, "We were both so blinded that we did some things that hurt our feelings, and we apologize from the bottom of our hearts." Barbara looked at the two of us, and the look on her face eased. Well, now that you've cleared up your doubts, I won't dwell on it any longer. But you did give us quite a shock and disappointment, especially you, Cindy. I'm sorry, Barbara. I was really impulsive and reckless. Cindy said sincerely, I'm here to apologize again if I made you angry with me. But please believe me, I've learned my lesson and will never do anything like that again. Barbara looked at Cindy and finally nodded. Well, that's it then. But as friends, I still remind you to be considerate and trust each other. Otherwise, it will be really ridiculous. Next, we visited several other friends who were there that day. For the doubt and disappointment on their faces, we didn't argue, but apologized sincerely over and over again, and promised that such a thing would never happen again. Gradually, everyone's emotions seemed to ease. After all, the relationship between Cindy and me was obvious to everyone. They believed that as long as we learned from this lesson, we would cherish each other even more in the future. After leaving her last friend's house, Cindy sighed and said, somewhat wearily, we seem to have said all our apologies today. Luckily, everyone eventually forgave us. I nodded my head and felt relieved. Yes, we did something wrong, but through sincere apologies and explanations, we finally won back everyone's understanding. This episode was completely over. So, honey, is there anything you want to say to me now? I smiled and put my arm around Cindy's shoulders, and she seemed to have her energy back. Cindy looked back with love in her eyes. I want to say, Jim, I love you. Although we've been through some ups and downs, I'm sure we'll be able to cherish each other even more from now on and work together to get through everything. I looked deeply into my wife's eyes, and the familiar warmth and love filled us again. We looked at each other and smiled, and kissed each other longingly under the setting sun. After a few weeks, we finally got over the crisis. Life gradually returned to its original rhythm. It is hard to deny that the experience was a shocking one, but ultimately it turned into a new impetus and sustenance for our relationship. One day at noon, I had just returned home from the restaurant. When I opened the door, I saw Cindy sitting on the couch, lost in thought. She didn't seem to notice my arrival. I closed the door and sat down next to her, and she looked over as if she were waking up from a dream. Hey, what's on your mind? Why are you wandering off? I asked with concern. Cindy smiled slightly. I was just thinking that we were so tired and worn out that it led to a string of misunderstandings and conflicts like the one we just had. It dawned on me that everything that had happened in the past few weeks was replaying in my mind. We took a good look at our words, actions, and hearts and realized that we had been overworking and neglecting each other's feelings. It's the workload that makes us lack the care and respect we deserve. Then we should both pay attention in the future. I said, don't put all your energy into your work all the time, and make more time for each other and the family. Yeah, or we'll just get in deeper and deeper and end up falling apart. Cindy agreed. I'm so guilty of doing something like that. Hey, don't mention it. I hurriedly interrupted her. The most important thing now is that we have to face life with a new attitude and cherish the people in front of us. If we keep living in the past, we'll never get out. Cindy nodded, her eyes much firmer. You have a good point. In the future, no matter what happens, I must trust you first and then communicate with you. I will never make the same mistake again. Then let's start now. I looked deeply at my wife, and we smiled at each other. Thus, a deep kiss rose between us, leaving all doubts and misunderstandings behind. I pressed Cindy tenderly underneath me, and the two of us kissed on the sofa. This kind of feeling has not been experienced for too long. It seems like a lifetime ago. It is precisely the experience of suffering and conflict that makes us cherish the happiness and beauty in front of us. In the days that followed, I deliberately spent more time with Cindy. Instead of working overtime or going out to socialize, we just stayed at home quietly, either spending time together or chatting with each other. Sometimes Barbara and Tony would bring the kids over, and we would spend time as a family in the living room. This is the kind of life we cherish and aspire to. A small home filled with laughter and warmth. One weekend afternoon, Cindy and I were sitting under the swing set when Barbara took her cell phone and recorded a video of us. You see, that's what life is all about, Barbara smiles. Barbara smiled and said, being together as a family, not worrying about anything, just loving each other. You have to cherish this. I nodded and winked at the camera, while Cindy nestled in my arms, shyly pressing her face into my chest. Yes, this is our most precious treasure, our most precious life. We were once shrouded in misunderstanding and suspicion, but now we have finally come out of the haze and are standing firmly together again. As long as we always have a heart of reverence, always mutual tolerance and trust, I believe that there will be no such ups and downs again. I will always cherish this woman in front of me and will always regard her as the most precious companion in my life. A month later, at noon, Barbara and Cindy met for lunch at a nearby diner. I can't believe it's been over a month. Barbara took a bite of her sandwich and said with great emotion, "Looking back, you acted like two kids." Cindy laughed awkwardly. Yes, during that time, we were really overwhelmed by jealousy and suspicion. Luckily, in the end, reason overcame impulse, or our relationship would have been over. I'm sincerely happy for you. Barbara said sincerely, "It's a relief for all of us friends to see you back together." Yeah, we gave you guys a lot of trouble during that time. Cindy smiled shyly. Maybe that's what happens when there's a lack of trust and communication. Barbara nodded in agreement. In the end, you have to understand each other's personalities and learn to understand and tolerate each other. Just like Jim, he's a hothead. I think he'll be a little more sensible in the future. Yeah, I've noticed some changes in Jim lately. Cindy said thoughtfully as she put down her utensils. He's always deliberating before making any big decisions. And even at home, sometimes I can see that he's more careful and thoughtful than ever. Barbara smiled and nodded. That's right. If Jim can learn from this lesson, he won't be so easily misled and emotional again. Anyway, both of you are slowly learning to mature. Cindy smiled back. Yes, Jim is definitely more stable and sophisticated now. As long as he keeps this up, I don't have to worry about him being influenced by gossip anymore. I'll totally trust and accept his new style. The two of them smiled at each other, raised their cutlery in their hands once again, and spent a joyous afternoon together. I looked at my wife's serene and peaceful face and suddenly felt grateful for all that this experience had brought us. If not for this sharpening, I may never have realized my own style of immaturity and never be able to think differently about Cindy's situation and inner world. Now, I have learned from this experience, and I have learned to restrain my impulses, keep my wits about me, and to look at her with empathy. This experience is like a baptism, pulling us out of the frivolity and childishness, so that we have embarked on a wiser and more stable path of life. In this way, we re-examined each other and knew how to cherish the people in front of us. Let's join hands and bask in this warmth and happiness together. I will always cherish my relationship with Cindy, and I will never let this precious, precious remnant of my life be wasted or harmed. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a story to share about your own or someone else's experience, please feel free to contact me. Take care.